In recent videos, I've talked about the Brexiteers negotiators behaving badly. I've also talked about the incoherence of the UK position, particularly in regards to things like the Northern Ireland Protocol and how they're approaching free trade agreements. And those videos have generated some quite interesting discussions on the topic, so I thank everyone who's contributed to that. But I come to a little bit of a realization myself. What I've realized is that we're in danger of making certain assumptions. And those assumptions can be driven by our political viewpoints, our biases, and even our inability to actually understand what is going on. But what I've also realized is that we're in this position of just not understanding what is happening. Why are Brexiteers behaving so badly? What is in it for them? What are they trying to achieve? Because at the end of the day, there must be some logic to them in what they're doing. So what we need to do is we need to understand that logic. And this is a critical thing to do for any negotiator. When you are in a position negotiating with the other side and you're starting to get frustrated and you're starting to feel like you don't understand where they're coming from, you need to take a step back, put some critical thinking in, and start to challenge your assumptions. And I think we should do that here. So let's check what perhaps we are assuming. Why are these Brexiteers adopting such incoherent and adversarial positions on these issues? Why are they doing what appear to be completely illogical things that are very counterproductive? One argument is that they're just stupid. And as much as I would like to adopt that argument, actually I think this is a very dangerous assumption to make. Let's assume that, well, not an assumption, it's true that the vast majority of Brexiteers are members of the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party has plenty of stupid people, like anybody else does, but they also have plenty of very intelligent people. In addition, they have plenty of money to hire very intelligent people. So I think the argument that the Conservatives are being completely stupid is perhaps a dangerous one. And I think we need to try to avoid thinking that. There is no doubt an element of truth in believing that is going on, but it is dangerous to assume it. And I always say to anyone in any negotiation, if you go into there assuming that the other side are stupid, you're probably going to get yourself into a load of trouble. What may appear to be stupidity to you may just be a different form of logic on their side. The trick is understanding that logic. So what is another argument ideological dogma? Are the Conservatives and UKIP and Brexit and whatever other party political people, are they just so ideologically wedded to Brexit that no matter what, everything must fit that narrative? Now again, this is a credible argument to some form. But again, I also point out that there's plenty of people who are not wedded to that argument, who are perhaps supporting what is going on. And with that in mind, while there's an element of truth in believing that this is ideologically driven, that their positions are ideologically driven, I think, again, we have to dig deeper. We have to go behind what is the actual logic of what they're doing. How does it even fit their ideology? Do we assume that they're corrupt, that they want the tax breaks? Again, this is perhaps likely to be an element of truth, especially in light of recent events, but I don't think it can tell the whole story. Because we all know that corruption, especially blatant corruption, is something that brought down the Conservative government in the late 90s. The current lot should be aware of that, so they won't want to be too blatant about it. So you can't imagine that every decision they're making is due to corruption. So are they just pandering to the vote? And this, I think, is perhaps where we should focus a bit more attention. What is it that political Brexiteers, not the other types of Brexiteers, but the political Brexiteers are actually trying to achieve here? But at the end of the day, they're politicians. And the ultimate aim of politicians, of course, is to get elected into government. So I want to focus more into this. This is the particular assumption I want to look at, and I want to encourage that we minimize the other assumption that we might be making. So I think we need to have a really uncomfortable conversation here. This is a conversation that UK political establishment is very unwilling to have, at least in public. And I think it's important to look into this because I think this is perhaps driving some of the current behaviours. So I'm going to rewind back in history and I'm going to focus on a particular moment. 2006 in September the 12th, Nigel Farage was elected the leader of UKIP. Now he'd been in UKIP for, since the beginning, but this was the time that he took charge. And this is when things really started to change. UKIP changed their position. They became much more anti-immigration, became much more forceful, gained an increased media profile, perhaps became even more strident. And in parallel to that, the Conservatives had always had an anti-European bloc within it. But during this period of time, that increased. But perhaps we shouldn't confuse the two necessarily. But what we can definitely say, and certainly going from memory, is that the whole conversation about whether to be in or out of Europe really changed around this time. So I think the purpose of understanding the current set of behaviours and why they're adopting their positions, we need to go back into history and ask what actually happened. What were these changes? And how does that feed into what's going on now? So I did a bit of digging, and this is where things are going to get very uncomfortable, perhaps for some. Well, I thought let's focus on the UKIP vote. Very simply, it took me quite a lot of digging to get this data. It's on the internet, not too difficult to search for. And I looked at what the UKIP election results were, and the general elections and the European election. And I kept this simple. I've only focused on percentage vote share because focusing on the data like seats and changes and so on muddies the picture. I kept it really simple, vote share. And we can see in 2005, before Nigel Farage was elected, that the UKIP vote share was 2.2%. And then in 2010, it went up to 3.1%. But the big jump worth noticing is 2015, when the UKIP share under Nigel Farage went up to 12.64%. And going a little bit to the other side, the other table, on the you can see a similar pattern on the European side of it. They've always done stronger in the European elections. So they were at 16%, marginal increase to 17%, but 2014, big jump to 27.5%. And then, of course, we had the referendum, whether to leave the EU in 2016. So UKIP, as a political force, became almost extinct in 2017 general election and the 2019 European elections. There was just no point. UKIP, they served no viable purpose, and the election abandoned them. So let's focus a little bit on 2015, 2014, 2015, because this is the important part. And one thing that I remember from that time is that Farage changed tactics. Because before that time, UKIP was all about Europe. It was about the corruption in Europe, the lack of democratic status of Europe, the slow procedures and decision-making of Europe. That was the narrative that UKIP put forward. And it gained some traction, but it didn't gain a lot of votes. Most of the people who cared were probably in the Conservative Party. So what changed between 2010 and 2015 to give them that 12.6%? And the most obvious change, apart from an increased media profile, was the switch driven by Farage to talking about immigration. Huge change. And it changed the whole narrative. It became the anti-immigration type theme. And as much as people might wish to deny it, there's no doubt that that was a strong driver for the increased vote share that UKIP obtained at the time. So how do I prove it? This is a hypothesis. Many of us believe this, but how do we prove it? And that's not going to be easy. So let's have a look at a little bit of different data. And on this one, I picked BNP. Remember them, the British National Party? Now, hardly anyone talks about them anymore, but back around 2005, 2006, they were in the news quite a lot. They were starting to make some gains. There were concerns about what UKIP were representing. Because fundamentally, those who voted for the BNP and parties like them were hardcore racists. That is pretty much the truth. It's not too controversial to say that. So let's look at the data and let's stack it up directly in comparison to the UKIP data. So you can see in 2005, BNP had 0.7%. 2010, they had 1.9% of the vote. 2015, 0%. Now compare that to UKIP, 12.64%. Now I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, well, 2% does not make a jump all the way up to 12%. And yes, that is a fair statement. However, it is not too much of a jump to believe that all those people who used to vote to the BNP, and don't forget, voting for the BNP was something you did secretly. It was almost shameful. It was very hard for anyone to admit they voted for the BNP. They were seen as a very toxic party. And if you were a dedicated racist, you either mingled with other dedicated racists, where you could have that conversation, or in more polite society, you didn't admit to that sort of thing. But you can admit to voting for UKIP. They were not a BNP. They didn't have the toxicity and the bad branding that a BNP did. So you can imagine that the 1.9% realised that the BNP were a dead political force, but UKIP, with their anti-immigration agenda, was much closer to what they wanted. So they switched. And that's a 1.9% link. By the way, for the additional parties in the electoral roll, which I've not listed here, but the likes of EDL, National Front, maybe even English Democrats, they represented about 0.1 to 0.3% of the vote. So let's throw that in there and let's round it up a little bit and say 2.2%. 2.1, 2.2%. Yeah, switch over to UKIP from the hardcore racists. Now remember, these are hardcore racists. They're not what you might jokingly refer to as mild or light racists. So I think for those people who had racist tendencies, and I'll come on to that conversation a bit more in a minute, they would have found it easier to vote for UKIP, more socially acceptable than they would for the BNP, because they weren't the hardcore type. They like to think of themselves as decent, but those foreigners are taking our jobs type conversation, whatever it might be. So I don't think we should really assume that only 2% of racists went to UKIP. But how do we prove how much of a percentage shift did UKIP attract? Now I'm going to post some links in the comments section below in the description to some analysis work that's been done by it. I'm not an expert on this, and I wouldn't try and duplicate the work that's done by people far knowledgeable than I am. But I'm going to make a working assumption here, because this is what we have to do. I'm going to assume that 5% of that 12.6% is what I'm going to term the racist vote. Now, from what I've read, the experts are likely to say that my assumption here is very much under, not over, the reality. Any society, and the UK is absolutely no exception to any other country, is going to have at least 5% of the population are going to identify as racist, really. Many people believe that figure is considerably higher. But for the purpose of the analysis we're conducting here, I'm going to assume 2 to 5% racist vote that UKIP relied upon to obtain that 12.6% electoral share. And this is a conversation no one wants to have. And it's very hard to prove. I'm having to make a lot of speculative assumptions here. But I don't think it's too off the wall. I think it's reasonably safe to say that this happened. Now, of course, even if we assume 5%, that's not 12.6%. So we should also assume that the rest of the people who supported UKIP voted because, not for racist reason, possibly not even anything to do with immigration at all, just because they did not believe in the EU project. They thought it was corrupt, they thought it was undemocratic, they thought it was not suitable for how they should govern their lives. And whatever disagreements everyone may have, I would argue that that is a valid political viewpoint to have. There's also an element that UKIP attracted the kick the establishment vote. People who just wanted to, put two fingers up against the, senior levels of politics. We don't have accurate figures for all of this, but I think we should assume that they are in there, and the UKIP attracted these votes and was able to influence David Cameron and the Conservative Party, and able to force through the referendum. My final point on this racist issue: the referendum was won on a swing of 2%. So 2 to 5% of a racist vote is enough to have swung that referendum result. Now, this has been commented on extensively by various people, like in the radios and so on. And I think we have to make a clear distinction that not everyone who voted for Brexit is racist. But I think it is a vast injustice to this other group of people who supported UKIP, who voted for Brexit for what I call legitimate political reasons. But their vote has been tainted by the fact that this racist vote is likely to have been significant enough to have won that referendum. And that is never going to go away, that stain. And this is part of the reason why we have such a polarised opinion in the UK for those who are for and against Brexit. We all know this. And that's just the facts. That's the reality, as much as we can understand it from the limited data we have available. But that doesn't answer what's going on now. So this is what I'm going to turn to now. Who is getting this vote now? And why does that matter to the bad Brexit behaviours that we are seeing when it comes to Northern Ireland protocols and free trade agreement? Well, let's dig into this. Okay. What are the reasons that people had for voting for Brexit? Immigration, racism, we know that. One category, we're saying it's around about 5%. That's a working assumption. We've also got those people who are just against waste, against corruption and unaccountability in the EU. Unspecified number, but definitely a reason. We talked about the anti-establishment reason. And we've also, and this is one of the things that hasn't been given sufficient prominence in discourse in recent years, is that quite a lot of people who voted for Brexit did so because they wanted democratic change. Take back control was a cunning mantra, it was a cunning slogan. It was designed to appeal to these people. It promised them something, something better. Yes, arguably that was a lie, but it was cunning messaging, and it tapped into these people that wanted democratic change in the UK system. They wanted better accountability. And that is a conversation for another day. But that is something I would argue is a positive reason why people voted for Brexit. And it doesn't have to be about Brexit. It can be in any other aspect of UK political discourse. So we shouldn't forget that. That is a significant desire, I think, in UK politics for democratic change. And that desire is being tainted and suppressed by the current political class, particularly the Conservative Party, who actually have a very strong non-desire for democratic change, as even the events of this week and what they have done in Parliament to protect corrupt MPs has shown. Any democratic change is a threat to them. So they've appealed to the vote to gain what they wanted, but they actually now need to suppress it to preserve their interests. And there's a final reason I also want to talk about, and this has been covered by academics, and it's not a significant political discourse, although I suspect Boris Johnson is keenly aware of this. And this is the fact that many people voted against globalisation. Those who are left behind, particularly the working class, who used to have manufacturing jobs, their jobs have been taken away, outsourced to India and to China. Globalisation, global supply chains, has not benefited them. The EU, incidentally, has a strong ideological belief in globalisation. So again, we can see another category of why people voted to get rid of the EU. Self-interest in a way. They wanted political attention to help support them. And Boris Johnson knows this. This is why he is aggressively pushing forward the levelling up agenda. It is specifically to target this demographic that voted for Brexit and probably voted for the Conservative Party in 2019 with this in mind. So these are all the reasons why people voted for Brexit, and we should bear these in mind. So what do Brexiteers actually want going forward? They want more national control. Now again, this could be a conversation to be had another time. The way UK democracy actually works is one of the least democratic systems in the world. It's old, it's dated. So ironically enough, it's less democratic than the EU, structurally speaking. But it's a very seductive message that the UK could restore the sovereignty of Parliament. That messaging, I think, has taken a bit of a battering this week in view of and in recent years, prorogue in Parliament and all the things that Johnson has done. It very much tried to take control for personal use, not for parliamentary use. And that is the subject of much conversation now, which I don't want to cover, but I just want to highlight that here. Also, another desire of Brexiteers, and let's be honest, is to be hostile to foreign people. Look at what Priti Patel is doing. Look at the huge reluctance to agree visas for EU workers to come in and fill all the shortages that are currently experiencing the UK supply chain. So there's very much a political desire to have a hostile climate. And this has been referenced before. And of course, less global trade, really, I would argue. Because made in Britain, levelling up, it's a very much an obvious aspect of the Conservative Party policy that more of whether it's manufacturing or services or any other work creating or job creating activity should come back to the UK. Perhaps should come away from China, should come away from Europe, or come away from India, wherever, and come back to the UK. Those people who did not benefit from globalisation. So arguably, the Brexit project is anti-trade. We'll come back to that. And of course, there is one of our assumptions made earlier: wealth protection, protecting the wealthy from taxes or regulations. And I highlight this because perhaps when you're looking at how the trade agreements have been agreed, and they do serve this purpose. It's not an explicit purpose, but they do serve that purpose. And this has been highlighted by some analytical work done by experts. So these topics here may be really the genuine agenda for those hardcore Brexiteers. This is what they want to achieve. So what does this mean going forward? Again, I keep saying, come back to pandering to the voters. The Conservative Party, the Brexit Party, Brexiteers, they want to get re-elected. They want to continue in government. They want to carry on their project, whatever it is their project goals are. And these are things you always have to understand when you're negotiating. And I have no doubt that the EU negotiators would have conducted this analysis. Maybe they've reached the same conclusions. Maybe they've reached different conclusions. But the big question for them is, what do they do about it? And this has been referenced. You can see this referenced by European political figures. They talk about the fact that what the Brexiteer is doing, what Lord Frost is doing, is pandering to a domestic audience, to a domestic gallery. So this is about the next coming election, perhaps. That's the argument. So who's going to vote for the Conservative? Well, traditionally it's been big business and big money. But are big businesses going to continue to support the Conservatives in view of what they've done to the UK economy, what they've done in terms of erecting trade barriers? You might argue they won't. But then, of course, big business don't actually vote. They give money to the Conservative Party, but maybe that's not so important now. Maybe a smaller number, but higher value donors, the big money, separate category. The Tories can maintain their support on the basis of protecting wealth, in terms of what they are doing. And I mentioned that before. So who else can be voting for Conservatives? Well, there's tribal loyalties. The people who've always voted Conservatives will continue to do so. And perhaps the Conservatives have made a calculation that be enough of these people will stay loyal with them. But it is a risk. A lot of the tribal loyalists are probably likely to have a high number of people who did not vote for Brexit. And whilst they may be loyal to the Conservative Party, if the whole Brexit project becomes so toxic and unpalatable, particularly because of the destruction of the UK economy, the Conservative Party may lose that vote. And this has been voiced as a concern. So what's the next category? The left behind generation. And I've perhaps made a bit of an assumption here, made a bit of an association that may be unwarranted. But I've said the red wall. Is that the red wall? Boris Johnson famously won the red wall in 2019. And people who wanted Brexit to stop being a hot topic, but also wanted the government to get on with the job of investing in their local communities. So that's what the Conservatives, those are a swing vote. And they can go either way. They can go to Labour or they can go to the Conservative. So when we're looking at the behaviours of what Brexiteers are doing, they've got to pander to this group. They've got to prove in some ways that all the trade deals they're signing up to benefit them. And yes, it does seem to harm traditional Conservative voters like farmers. But it may not harm them when it comes to winning the red wall. That may be the calculation. Because if less work is being outsourced to those countries in the Pacific region, because in reality the Brexiteers have signed such terrible trade agreements that actually trade is reduced, then they've actually served the desire of this demographic. And of course we have the final category, the one that we spoke about earlier, the anti-immigration, the racists. And remember I said they are 5%. So let's assume that the tribal loyalist and the red wall is enough for the Conservatives to match Labour, for example, 50-50. 5% swing of a previously untapped generation until Nigel Farage came along is enough to win an election. And that's famously the case in countries like the US, for example. They say they never focus on the safe seats. They always focus on the marginal votes, the swing voters. That is what wins you the election. And Boris Johnson not only gained their vote in 2019 because of his aggressive Brexit policy, but he also gained the left behind generation who wanted less trade, but more prosperity in local communities. So these are the groups, perhaps, that the Brexiteers need to pander to win the next election. So let's look at what's going on in the Northern Ireland Protocol, where Northern Ireland doesn't vote Conservative. So could they be an acceptable collateral cost? Scotland doesn't vote Conservative. Again, can they be an acceptable collateral cost? So all those who could vote Conservative might see their interest being served by the current shenanigans going on about the Northern Ireland Protocol, about a free trade agreement. Maybe not so much on the fishing and the farming side of it, but arguably you might say that fishing and farming might again be acceptable casualties because they don't represent such a high proportion as those final two categories in this slide here. The left behind generation and the anti-immigration grouping. They may be enough to swing, and that's what this may come down to. Their behaviours and everything they are doing is not really that ideological. It's actually coldly, tactically strategic. They just want to win the next election. And all their behaviour, all the use of the media, the use of the messaging, will be targeted at these groups with the specific purpose of winning the next election. So when critically analysing the incoherence of their position on things like the Northern Ireland Protocol and why they're rejecting the EU's quite generous and reasonable proposals, without even further consideration, it doesn't suit this agenda. This agenda has, to win these votes means they have to reject the EU. They have to confront the EU, even in defiance of other things like the UK economy, even as well at the risk of losing traditional tribal loyalists and perhaps the support of big business, because that might be an acceptable loss in order to gain all those other swing voters that they otherwise would not have. So that perhaps is a rather controversial and awkward dive into why the current behaviours are being displayed in these Brexit trade negotiations. I welcome people's thoughts on this, whether there's any counter-analysis that you may have, and whether this perhaps has been too cynical. But regardless of that, I would always encourage people to think in this way, to apply this kind of thinking when you're in a negotiation. Try and understand their true motivation. Try and find some evidence to support it, and then try and exploit or whatever, in order to conduct your negotiation. Because that is the challenge facing the EU now. They probably do understand this. They now need to figure out a strategy to combat it. And maybe even the strategy is where we don't have to combat it. It's not our problem anymore. They're not in the EU. That may be their eventual calculation. But right now, they're trying to protect Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland as well, for that matter. That is where they're coming from. And they will be looking at this and thinking, what do we do to counter this? In view of what's going on. And it's going to be difficult for them, no doubt about it. So I hope you found that interesting, and look forward to seeing people's discussions on this topic.